Hello, everyone. Welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online health psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in culture and health. Now, this can be a pretty dense chapter, as theoretically you could cover the impact of every culture that currently exists on health beliefs and health outcomes, as well as every culture that has ever existed. Now, obviously, this lecture is going to be long enough, so we were going to select a handful of specific cultures, explain kind of the history, some of the history behind these cultural beliefs and cultural structures, with, of course, many supporting studies. Now, with all that said, let's jump into it. Beginning with a operational definition of culture, Corin in 1995 defined culture as, quote, a system of meanings and symbols. This system shapes every area of life, defines a worldview that gives meaning to personal and collective experience, and frames the way people locate themselves within the world, perceives the world, and believe in the world. Every aspect of reality is seen as embedded within webs of meaning that define a certain worldview and that cannot be studied or understood apart from this collective frame. So this is a rather thorough definition, and like all definitions that we've discussed, there are different theoretical debates on what culture is, but we are going to select this one that is for a different class. So what we have here really is, you can see kind of the meaning making embedded within culture. It gives you certain frames of reference, a lens of understanding in which you can understand the world, you can understand yourself, and importantly, you can understand each other. So you have a quote unquote individual identity that is wrapped up in this kind of collective web of social relationships, this collective identity that you have as well. And all societies, no matter where you live, have a culture. It's just that in general, when you live in a particular culture, you don't notice it. It's like a fish living in a fish tank situation. You don't know you're in a fish tank. You don't know that other fish tanks exist. Obviously, kind of a stretch here, but something like that, metaphorically speaking. We have two schools of thought related to culture that we're going to talk about here. The first, cross-cultural psychology, which views culture as a fixed set of beliefs, meanings, and symbols that belong to a group of people who speak a common language and may also adhere to a common religion and system of medicine. While cultural psychology views culture as a developmental and dynamic system of signs that exist in continuously changing narratives and stories. People's reactions to illnesses are driven by a constant struggle for meaning in light of beliefs that are evolving across space and time. The belief of any given individual is produced through the mediation of that person's particular history of social relations. Again, here, kind of a little deep in theory, but our two kind of broad strokes here is that cross-cultural psychology, much more of a fixed system, aka it's static, less movement, less change. And again, without getting too deep into theory, it's almost like a pure structure situation. Like you're born into a specific context that is fixed, and you are influenced by that kind of system. And obviously, multiple people live within that society and are also influenced by that same structure. Again, kind of that structure being a lot more fixed. Versus cultural psychology, which is really kind of emphasizing almost like human agency and just kind of human interactions and social relationships, and how that kind of influences culture. So there are these beliefs, meaning systems. However, they're constantly interacting with people. That's how these things get intergenerationally transmitted, and ultimately how the cultural practices are carried out through a person or group every single day. And as such, as people are operating in their kind of physical reality, those cultural systems, those beliefs, meanings change through times. That's kind of like, if you want to sound fancy, dynamic. It's basically sets of variables, people interacting with each other in very complex ways that are difficult to measure, which in return kind of impact your personal narratives. We all have our personal narratives of like, oh, this is why I'm here today, but also our collective narratives. And as such, a person's health beliefs, or really any beliefs, are, again, mediated through a person's particular history of social relations. Mediation, for the non-stat heads, you can basically think of it as like a pathway. So you have your belief systems on one side of the path, and then to reach that side of the path, you're walking through a pathway, which is kind of your history of interacting with other people, And not just your personal interacting with other people, but the people you're interacting with also have their own personal history of social relationships, which they bring to the table when they're interacting with you. So again, this kind of complex web, you can kind of think of that Bronfenbrenner interactive set of social relationships impacting a person's belief system. Belief of health, of sickness, is going to be kind of wrapped up and heavily influenced by their overall striving for meaning in life. AKA, why am I sick? What does this mean to me? What does this mean to my ancestors? What does this mean to society? Something along those lines. And those meanings, again, are constantly changing through time, for a whole host of historical reasons. The world around you physically changes. There's new material, there's new goods. Also, there is not just, in general, a monolith cultures. There are subcultures competing against each other for, cultural hegemony or like dominance, or become the predominant culture. And these kind of clashes or cooperation can influence and shape a country's overall cultural beliefs. There's not just U.S. culture, for example, has significantly shifted over the last 200 years, and which is common, again, because cultures in a cultural psychology framework is, again, rooted in social relationships, which change over time and influence our beliefs and our overall country's beliefs. Some notes on general psychology versus cultural psychology. Cultural psychology focuses on cultural variation. It assumes that the mind is not independent of context or content. It studies the different meaning systems we create in our minds in response to living in different environments. Within this framework, they view culture as the message rather than the noise. So kind of a classic critique, or I should say a more classic, but also kind of a more modern, more popular critique of general psychology among the many, is that it kind of imagines psychology, the ways of thinking, your cognitive process, as kind of like these independent computers, basically, that are universally shared. And we want to isolate those processes to find kind of like the true human psychology. And thus, any other kind of environmental factor should be kind of removed from the equation. It's just noise that is interfering with the pursuit to, again, identify kind of this universal, almost like computer-based understanding of psychology. But cultural psychology argues that's not possible, and it's kind of like meaningless, because we are all social creatures. Humans are social creatures. We live in complex societies. We're all interacting with each other dynamically. Our psychological processes, our brain, our mind, whatever, given your philosophical belief, cannot by definition ever be removed from the context that you develop in. So thus, kind of like trying to do so is just not really useful to the real world because there's no practical application. And two, it kind of like a fundamental misunderstanding of like human psychology is basically the argument. There are a number of challenges in defining culture and thinking about groups of people as making up a particular cultural group. Boundaries between cultures are not always clear cut. People may immigrate from one place to another. You can be exposed to many different cultural ideas from places very far from where you live. Cultures are dynamic and change over time. They are not static entities, but rather are constantly changing. So again, kind of using that cultural psychology framework, we'll be leveraging in this class. So briefly stated here, kind of straightforward, people immigrate. No, in general, broadly speaking, and even I would almost say basically universal, no person a group of people have lived in a context their entire history of humanity. People have moved. People immigrate. People interact with each other. Thus, in general, there is not like this pure culture situation. All kind of countries, which have the nation state, again, have only existed for like 300 years, but all kind of territories, cultures, whatever, have interacted with each other through time. Not everybody interacting with everybody, but everything is kind of a mix of all kinds of different cultures that have existed for hundreds of thousands of years is kind of the idea here. Thus, kind of identifying a quote unquote specific culture is difficult because they often blend together. And especially in kind of a more globalized context where we're interacting with each other through like movies, TVs, talking to each other, traveling, creating like a monolithic economic system. The United Nations, all these things are make it difficult to kind of tease out, one specific quote unquote like pure culture or something like that. These boundaries blend together because humans interact with each other and learn from each other across time. There are as many variations within cultures as there are between cultures. Differences can come from temperament, such as predispositions towards certain personality traits, abilities, and attitudes. Various social groups that have their own cultures, such as living on a certain street, going to a certain school, playing on a sports team, and life history, specific views that shape one's, or specific experiences that shape one's views. So you can think about this like in the United States, like a specific state, for example, you can say has a general culture. But then you break it down even further, like this specific city, this specific block. These areas have their own history and contacts and interactions with each other, wherein those kind of daily interactions are going to kind of create subculture within a broader like country's culture. Moreover, you have kind of differences in different personalities. People will attend certain schools, and people have different sets of friends and different families, which are going to impact how they view the world. So, moreover, you're going to have gender effects, sexuality effects, race, class effects that shape how we view the world, shape our kind of like subcultures, and also shape kind of those dynamics, those clashes and cooperations among cultures within a society. Thus, and this is kind of a classical statistical kind of argument, wherein that differences between groups are always kind of less, and generally speaking, statistically, are always less than differences within groups. AKA, there are more differences within a culture, within a group, than there are differences between groups. For stats reasons, it doesn't really matter. Health belief systems. As societies evolve, health belief systems develop as bodies of knowledge are constructed and exchanged among those who undergo specialized training. This gives rise to the separation of expert or technical belief systems from traditional, folk, or indigenous systems. These two types of systems are not discrete, but interact and in a process of constant evolution. Although the majority of people in any society organize meaning-making through the use of loosely organized indigenous belief systems, the character of these is connected in some form with expert belief systems. Both ways of thinking about health draw upon a more general worldview located within particular local socio-political context. So basically what this thing is saying here is that as we organize society, we develop beliefs about, why you get sick, why you're healthy, but also through time, a specialization, a professionalization of health comes into being, which develop new kind of bodies of knowledge and really just kind of expertise based on this kind of specialized training. So you kind of have these kind of two dynamic systems, aka these folk traditional belief systems, and then this more professionalized, specialized health belief systems. And these two systems are going to interact with each other, again, in what do we love? Dynamic ways. And people will draw from both these kind of two broadly stated systems, where we have these traditional beliefs, these folk beliefs, these indigenous beliefs, while at the same time take from the specialized professional beliefs and kind of meld it together to form our, quote unquote, individual health belief, sets of health beliefs. And again, these kind of ways of thinking about health within a particular group or society, again, are going to be influenced by local and global socio-political context, which kind of straightforward, aka your belief system is going to be impacted by the world that you live in, your social, political, economic context. Western belief systems, classical views. The classical view of health and illness in the West is derived from the Greco, or for our UK people who are rolling over and panicking right now, Greco, Arabic medical system known as Galenic medicine. The central concept of Galen's formulation is the balance of four bodily fluids or humors. They include yellow and black bile, phlegm, and blood. Balance is equated with health, and imbalance implied ill health. So this is kind of the classic view of our body, kind of consisting again of these kind of like four elements. I don't know, maybe like Avatar or something. We're all the elements. But kind of the idea here is that the balance, some kind of symmetry of these four bodily fluids imply health, while kind of an imbalance of too much blood, too little blood, whatever, too much phlegm, too little phlegm, implies or is an indicator of ill health. This is always kind of a little fun little history thing, and also the for our neurobio heads out there, kind of the history of understanding how the brain works as kind of like a set of basically like irrigation systems within the brain. It's interesting, but in our case here, again, we're just focused on these four bodily elements as a classical understanding of where health is derived from. The Galenic tradition also, besides focusing on understanding natural processes, placed responsibility on individuals to look after themselves. Ill health was viewed as one consequence of a natural process, not a result of divine intervention. So we're looking for kind of a less kind of like spiritual, religious, God spiting you or something like that for ill health, but rather some kind of natural process. Again, we have these kind of four fluids and we've identified them, and now we have to like measure like, oh, depression, they didn't have that term, but whatever, depression is correlated with too much black bile or something like that. It's kind of the idea here. So we're trying to use some kind of science to understand health. But at the same time, we also, you can see kind of the Western tradition, again, overly broadly stated, of placing responsibility on the individual. So it's like you are an individual, you have certain responsibilities to take care of your health, which again is actually going to be influenced by kind of especially in the last 400 or 500 years or so, by kind of Protestant belief systems, which we'll touch on briefly. Moving on to Christian ideas and Western health belief system, again, broadly stated. During the Middle Ages in Europe, Galen's work became confined more to a learned few, and other ideas based upon religion became more commonplace. Ascetic tradition scorned concern for the body and instead promoted acts such as fasting and physical suffering, which supposedly led to spirituality. With the Protestant Reformation, this belief was replaced with the idea that the body has been given to humans by God. An individual's religious duty is to look after or care for the body. Illness was seen as a sign of weakness and neglect. To honor God required living a healthy life and abstaining from excess, especially in terms of sex and diet. All right, so from the Middle Ages, which is basically 500 to like 1500, we have Galen here, and we have our four fluids, and this is still maintaining some influence among professional classes, those medical professionals. However, we also have the mass of regular people who are deeply influenced by their religious beliefs. So some collections of like folk beliefs and kind of broader Christian beliefs influencing their beliefs in health, why you get sick, and the meaning of life, the meaning of illness. And then jumping ahead to basically the Protestant Reformation, which ranges from mid 1500s to basically the mid 1600s, broadly speaking. And during this time, we have the emergence of Protestant as a religion. We have the decline of feudalism, the emergence of capitalism, and the creation of the nation state, broadly speaking. So now we have just basically massive shifts in like the entire structure basically of Europe and much of the rest of the world, because colonialism is going to emerge out of this as well. And one specific health-related belief is that the idea that your body was given to you by God. So thus, it is your duty to take care of your body, and not taking care of your body means that you have neglected yourself, God, and thus you are kind of acting in sin. So kind of very much like this kind of personal responsibility through a lens of religion. And kind of the idea that don't have too much excess of everything. Instead, kind of focus on labor, maintaining yourself in like some kind of healthy way, maintaining like diligence in your religious beliefs, and thus also your kind of daily interactions in your health. And again, not doing, and thus illness is kind of seen as you neglecting to do so. Now, with time, those religious interpretations began to decline a little bit or interact with science in new and complex ways due to kind of advances in medical science and also a bunch of other things that we don't have time to go over. While in terms of the expert belief system, there have been increasing acceptance of a naturalistic view of disease, the moral basis of health continues to underline much of contemporary health belief. This is seen across many fields, aka Protestant values. So although we have had big advances in kind of an understanding of health, aka moving beyond our four little systems of phlegm, black phlegm, and all that, however, kind of those underlying values that emerged especially or accelerated, I should say, under that 16th, 17th century, still kind of exist today and are still reflected in our understandings of health, especially in kind of Western Europe and kind of the United States at large. And in kind of particularly kind of the Anglo-English speaking world, because that's, that's should kind of echo for you of today, kind of again, kind of that idea of very much like personal responsibility when it comes to health, and not adhering to that responsibility is sin. But in this case, it could be like secular sin, like you've put this on yourself, and now you're being harmed. Naturally speaking, it's kind of almost like a secular version of Protestants' values. Is kind of the argument here. Two streams of thought in knowing the world dominated the Enlightenment, aka this is basically like the 1700s. So we've largely completed the 60-year war. We're getting the nation state. We have capitalism. We have Protestantism. Now we have Enlightenment. Enlightenment kind of emerges out of that period. First was the acceptance of the distinction between superstition and reason. Second was the emergence of positivism, which emphasized the science based upon direct observation, measurement, and experimentation. Gave direct access to the real world. The 18th century saw a significant rise of individualism in Western society. Professional understanding of health and illness became more closely entwined with the knowledge of the individual physical body. So we have the Enlightenment now, and now we kind of have two kind of big beliefs here that we're going to talk about, and that is there's a difference between superstition and reason, aka like science and like folk belief, and we can engage in this thing called positivism, aka making observations in the world, directly measuring things, engaging in direct experimentation, which allows us to have an accurate understanding of the world. And at the same time, we're getting a greater emergence, acceleration of individualism as the nation state is formed. Again, the kind of Protestant values and capital is spreading across the world. So all these kind of dynamics are going on and impacting our understanding of health. And then we have this argument by Bennis, if you're watching this right now, and Cathabras argued that the biomedical view became dominant because of its view of humans, its alliance with physical science, and the steady improvement in the health of population that was attributed to medical intervention. So we have kind of improvements in lifespan. We have kind of new technology. Eventually, we discovered germ theory. We create vaccines, we're resolving polio, all these things. We're engaging in a specific form of science, referred to as positivism, and we're kind of theoretically seeing results here. And at the same time, that biomedicine kind of idea is consistent with and influenced by a Western emphasis on the individual. You made your choices, and thus you are kind of dealing with the health consequences of those choices. We then have the emergence of the biopsychosocial model of health. Criticisms of the biomedical model led to the World Health Organization to propose an extensive definition of health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not the mere absence of disease or infirmity. Definition widened the scope of healthcare to consider not only the well-being of the individual, but also the community. So kind of the idea here is that we cannot only rely on, quote unquote, the physical sciences, like saying, health is purely the absence of illness, because it's very just like bio base, basically. So you have cancer, you don't have cancer. Do you have diabetes? You do not have diabetes. You don't have diabetes, you're healthy. You have diabetes, you're not healthy. Here, though, we add this psycho and social aspect of health. So we have the bio, which exists, but we also add these other variables, which in return is going to influence our understanding of what health means. So in this case here, we have the World Health Organization defining health as a state of, again, physical, mental, and social well-being, not just the absence of disease, but kind of the fulfillment of these kind of three components. And as such, you must consider not only the health of the individual, but also the well-being of the community, because social relationships, your psychology, will ultimately impact your state of health. So it's building on the earlier biomedical model of health. According to Engel in 1980, the various aspects of health and illness can be organized in a hierarchy from the biosphere in society down through the individual level of experience and behavior to the cellular and subatomic level. All of these levels interact and need to be considered for you to understand health and illness. So again, kind of like the Bronfenbrenner model here, wherein we have all these kind of big structures, those systems that interact with each other to impact their development. It's kind of the same idea here. Here we have a hierarchy wherein we have like the biosphere. Like, do you live in a climate that is capable of sustaining human life, or to the extent that it can? Which is, we'll see how that goes in the future. And then, so from starting all the way up there to like society, how society is structured, politically, socially, economically, all the way down to your individual person's actions, belief systems, all the way down to their cellular level, subatomic level. And ultimately, all these variables are inherently linked together and are all affecting each other. And thus, to understand health and illness and resolve or make aid in creating a healthy person, you basically have to create a kind of healthy society, a healthy planet, educate people to have healthy beliefs or something like that, is kind of the argument here. Moving on to Chinese views of health, traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, is greatly influenced by the religion and philosophy of Taoism. It is kind of argues that health is a balance of two basic powers of yin and yang, which governs the whole universe, including human beings. A disharmony in yin and yang leads to illness. A variety of methods, including acupuncture and herbal medicines, can be used to restore this harmony. So a couple of broad points here. One issue with kind of saying traditional anything, like traditional belief systems, is they can be so broadly stated that they have no meaning. Like, does tradition mean 200,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago? What specific tradition are we talking about? So that's a common challenge with this. In China, as kind of like a state as we understand it, is kind of like a complete kind of control, like centralized kind of influence across the country is kind of like relatively new, like 150-year-old phenomenon, without getting into too many specifics here. So with all that said, this traditional Chinese medicine, will just broadly speaking, with all those kind of caveats and issues about saying tradition, we have the idea of yin and yang, that kind of balance situation, wherein you have, if you have too much of one or the other, this can contribute to illness. And thus kind of the idea here is to create healthcare practices that help to restore that balance, that harmony between those two basic powers of the universe. Confucianism is also influential in the traditional Chinese views of health. Human suffering is traditionally explained as the result of destiny, or Ming. An important part of your destiny depends upon your horoscope, or patsu. During an individual's life, his or her patsu is paired with the timing of nature. Over time, these pairings change and create the individual's luck, or yun. So immediately you can see kind of some strong differences with kind of traditional Western, especially like Protestant beliefs ideas. Here we can kind of see basically more of the impact of forces beyond your control, something larger than you impacting your health, how you behave regarding like health-related decisions. You have things that you cannot control. It's not purely the individuals. And this can include your horoscope. So, which is always funny, because when people, obviously, in the US or whatever, they're like, "Oh, this is my horoscope," and I'm like, "Okay, which horoscope, bro?" There's like multiple cultural different horoscopes, and they aren't like correlated. You just happen to be picking the horoscope that you were born into in your culture and trying to derive like a worldview from it. Sidebar issue. Horoscopes, In the US, not real, folks. But just an example of a funny example. If you were born in a different context, you would have a completely different horoscope. But I digress. Also, you can see, though, here the impact of luck. This idea of like, hey, shit just happens to you and you have, again, no control of it or little control of it, and that's going to impact you. Again, those are in conflict in many ways with the kind of Protestant idea that no, it's not luck. It's like your grind set that's kind of going to impact your health outcomes. And consequently, it's going to have different frames of understanding of somebody who is unhealthy. Why is that person unhealthy? Is going to be influenced by these different views of health. We also have Buddhist belief systems reflected in Chinese medical belief systems. Good deeds and charitable donations, for example, are promoted. The afterlife retribution is expected for those who commit wrongs. And an important concept in this respect is Pao, which has two types, reciprocity and retribution. In mutual relationships, reciprocity is expected. When this does not occur, some form of retribution will take place. So now we have kind of like a moral belief system kind of wrapped up in Chinese medical belief systems. In this case here, we have this idea of good deeds, charitable donations, impacting your expectations of how you should treat each other, and then kind of consequently how you are kind of treated following death in some kind of afterlife scenario. So now we have an expectation of reciprocity, like we are engaging in kind of mutually beneficial behavior for our kind of collective good within this life and in some kind of theoretical afterlife. So again, you can see really the collective roots in these sets of beliefs found within the Chinese medical belief systems. And then again, consequently, or kind of maybe reflecting, depending on kind of your theoretical approach, but probably, again, dynamically interacting with how you view the world. How do you understand history? How do you understand each other? How do you understand death, illness, your expectations of each other? Just this really wrapped up in this kind of global kind of philosophy of the world, which are going to trickle down to health-related beliefs. And how you teach your future medical professionals and teachers and all these things, because those medical professionals, those teachers are always going to convey certain sets of values, even if it's not explicitly said. All teaching is transmitting cultural values. So as stated, these influences are not only codified within Chinese medicine, but also influence everyday lay beliefs about health and illness in Chinese communities around the world. Rochelle and Marks in 2010 explored the extent of medical pluralism among Chinese people in London. There are different medical approaches, treatments, and institutions that people can use while pursuing health. A thematic analysis suggested that Chinese medicine and Western medicine were perceived as two systems of health provision and that these two systems could be used concurrently. So the question is not just how do medical professionals view health or like our philosophy of the world or how they view medicine, something like that, but how do regular people kind of digest that, internalize it, and interact with the world around them. And that's kind of what this Rochelle and Mark study is looking at, specifically Chinese people living in London. So they're bringing with them their beliefs that they were taught through time, and now interacting in a kind of a different cultural context. And then the question is, okay, well, how do they interact with the medical systems and medical beliefs of London, the UK, broadly speaking, Western health care belief system? And what these researchers found is that these people, Chinese people living in London, are able to interact with both systems, hold two sets of beliefs at the same time, and leverage them as needed. So it's not like they don't see it as kind of an either or, but rather maybe, and we'll talk about this later on, for some interpretations of illness, health, how they're feeling, what they should do. They leverage one system, and at other times they'll leverage a different system. Or at the same time, maybe together, some kind of mismatch of folk beliefs, of their home country beliefs, and kind of their new host country beliefs. Which is another example how it's quite difficult to always just draw clear cultural boundaries, because these are human beings, and we are all interacting with each other, and we're all affecting each other's beliefs and worldviews at kind of like all time. Jin and Acharya in 2016 suggested that yin-yang balance in Qi still influences practices related to medication adherence among people of Chinese descent in the US. Narratives also suggest that Western and Chinese medicine have strengths and limitations that can counteract each other. Participants also discussed the importance of social support and how they cope with the acculturation stress, especially when healthcare providers fail to understand their cultural beliefs and practices. So here we have Chinese Americans, this study kind of measuring their kind of beliefs and their medical related beliefs. And as kind of stated before, what the researchers found was that the sample viewed both sets of belief systems, aka Western and Chinese medicines, broadly speaking, as having both having strengths and weaknesses, and which these people, this population, can leverage. So when they need maybe certain treatment or certain sets of beliefs that make them cope with understanding illness at the time or health at the time, they can leverage one system. When they need other beliefs or other practices, they can leverage another one. So kind of taking from both and kind of a strength and weaknesses. Now, one also important point here is that often people with kind of different views of illness and health will interact with a healthcare system that really does not completely adhere to their cultural practices and beliefs. And so this is very common, or can be common, and this is called kind of acculturation stress. So basically kind of the stress of interacting with a culture that is not familiar with yours and is and can maybe be contradictory or completely different from yours. And that can increase kind of stress levels. Now, what participants reported here is that they leverage and kind of utilize social support from other people with who share their background or sets of healthcare related beliefs to kind of decrease stress and anxiety that can happen when you are a person interacting with a healthcare system and they're kind of like maybe overlooking or just not aware or just don't care and don't believe it in your cultural practices and beliefs. So kind of leveraging that kind of collective support system to decrease culture-related stressors, which actually in return is kind of acts as a protective factor, aka reducing the negative effects of experiencing these accumulation of stressors, which is common not just in this sample, but social support is a well-established protective factor when it relates to health or kind of most or any developmental outcome for that matter. Moving on to Islamic views on medicine, and speaking of something that is infinitely broad and something that existed for over 1,000 years and all kinds of different variations. But again, keeping it broad here, Islamic views on medicine. During sickness, Muslims are expected to seek Allah's mercy and help through prayer. Death is an inevitable part of life, and that the whole creation belongs to Allah, and to Him is the final return. These are specific health. There are specific health-related practices which Muslims follow. Healthcare providers need to have an understanding of general Islamic beliefs and practices to enable them to provide quality care for Muslim patients. Let's jump to some specifics before we break it down a bit. So, for example, healthcare professionals need to be aware of the need for modesty, privacy, appropriate use of touching clothing, dietary requirements such as halal and fasting during Ramadan. Availability of prayer rooms, interaction with opposite sex patients, use of medication, shared decision making, and its impact on the family. So kind of one of many reasons why this is important is because you're interacting with somebody as a healthcare professional of a different culture, and they have specific views of what is an action, a behavior that would be unhealthy. So kind of requiring that person or just being kind of unaware and unintentionally contributing to that person committing like some kind of sin or something that's not acceptable within this healthcare sets of belief, you're going to increase kind of stress and kind of alienation within that person, which in return is going to increase the likelihood that that person does not engage in maybe the or adhere to the advice of the medical professional or kind of increase stress within that person, and thus potentially exacerbating whatever the illness is or disorder that this person is seeking medical attention for. So, for example, interacting with a Muslim woman who's wearing who's a hijabi, requires a set of kind of requirements on how you interact with that person and And as like the kind of the previous Chinese studies went over, kind of to kind of bridge that those different views and kind of blend them dynamically, requires a kind of mindful cultural sensitivity that allows people to adhere to their belief systems while at the same time giving them opportunity to seek care. That are consistent with these cultural dynamics. And a big one here kind of being family. So kind of a classic in the West, again, kind of broadly speaking, is that your medical decisions are solely your own. But many other cultures, and we'll move on to momentarily other African and indigenous cultures, these kind of health related decisions are often kind of take a kind of go through a collective process of decision making. Ayurvedic medicine. The Ayurvedic system of medicine is based upon the Sanskrit words ayas, which is life, and Veda, science. This remains extremely extensive in India. It is estimated that 70% of the population of India and hundreds of millions of people throughout the world use Ayurvedic medicine, which is based on Hindu philosophy. Both the cosmos in each person or human being consists of a female component, Prakti, which forms the body, and a male component, Purusa, which forms the soul. So here we have a system based on some combination of just science, broadly speaking, and life, kind of interactions in the social world, very broadly speaking. And we have people made up of kind of two different components, one forming the body and the other forming the soul at large. The body is defined in terms of the flow of substances through channels, each substance having its own channel. Say this occurs when the channel is blocked and the flow is diverted into another channel. When all channels are blocked, the flow of substances is not possible and death occurs. At this stage, the soul is liberated from its bodily prison. So almost a little considerate or consistent with kind of earlier views of neurobiology. So sets of like flowing into systems of substances that can be too little or too much, some kind of like backage occurring, something along those lines, contributing to health or illness. However, Ayurvedic medicine has not dominated Western biomedicine, even within India. There are a variety of other competing health systems in pluralistic health cultures. In an interview study of a community in northern India, Morenis and Brilliant in 1981 found evidence not only of Ayurvedic beliefs, but also beliefs of Unami, another indigenous health system, allopathic, homeopathic, herbalist, folk, astrology, or some kind of their version of this, and religious systems. Systems may formally seem to conflict. Participants can draw on some or all of them to help explain different health problems. The strength of these beliefs is related to the immediate social situation and the roles and expectations of the community. For example, for women in some parts of Pakistan, the health belief system is a mixture of biomedicine, Unami medicine, which is a version of Galenic medicine. So this goes back to similar points we talked about. For all these kind of countries, there is variation within them, especially in these these countries that have as a quote unquote nation state of like India existing for, around 100 years or so, and parts of India breaking off into different countries, etc. So one, we have variation, but also we have this mismatch of these specific, localized folk understandings of health. We also have this kind of more national understanding of health, which in itself is going to be influenced by other countries and their own kind of traditional science that emerged from India. So not just Western science, but also like India science, like again, kind of mismatching together, which people can then again leverage to explain different health problems. So maybe one health set of health belief systems can allow for a person to make meaning and increase understandings and give a path forward on what to do about it. While that same system may not be as useful for when a person has a different illness or maybe a different part of their life, a different social situation or sets of expectations within a particular community at a particular time. So again, kind of flexible, not rigid. They have these different belief systems, they're aware of them, and they are using them as required. Moving on to Japan and kind of some of their views on psychotherapy, Japan also has a couple of unique approaches to psychotherapy that reflects their cultural inclinations, Morita and Naikin therapy. Morita therapy emphasizes secondary control, asking clients to accept the circumstances of their lives. The client must change their perspectives of the symptoms and learn to live productively in spite of those symptoms. Primarily used to treat depression and anxiety. To live productive lives, the treatment plan involves isolated bed rest, light manual activities such as sweeping, heavy manual labor such as chopping wood, reading, and other forms of life training, all in combination with medication and therapy sessions. So without getting in too much into the historical background of Japan here, you can see kind of some common elements here. We have a understanding of like a collective perspective on health, wherein you have maybe a disorder or depression, anxiety, something along those lines, are treated or managed by understanding that your life is directly connected to other people. Therefore, you kind of like a treatment includes kind of reintegrating yourself into society, maybe performing your duty or something like that to your family or your community. So some light manual labor, heavy manual labor. So doing chores around the house, maybe, or going outside and, I don't know, gathering firewood or something. But kind of a big takeaway here is that aspect of secondary control, aka something beyond your control impacting your health, thus again kind of a less emphasis on that individualism, which is classically common, especially since kind of the Protestant Reformation in Western Europe. We also have this Naikin therapy, which helps people gain insight on their past, used for people with depression and addiction problems. Clients are asked to reflect on their past, particularly on the kindness that they had received from others, while thinking about how little they have given in return for those kindness. For example, specifically thinking about close relationships with their mothers when they were young children. The therapist encourages clients to appreciate how indebted they are to the kindness of important close people in their lives. The goal is to reinterpret the past, recognizing it cannot be changed. Revisiting the past through the lens of gratitude can restructure it and give new meaning to people's lives. So here again, see the collective interconnectivity between people, so almost kind of like a cognitive reframing. But the cognitive reframe is not just like this asocial situation, or not necessarily just asocial, but much more directly collective in nature. So you are understanding that people are treating you with kindness, and that kindness reflects that, hey, you're a part of the society. There is a sense of belonging here, and it is your responsibility to reciprocate that kindness. So thus, you are all kind of like, we're all indebted to each other by definition, and that's how you get kind of back into it. Decrease addiction by kind of decreasing alienation from society. So kind of restructure how you see your life and give ultimately a new meaning, a new sense of belonging to a person. Continuing on with our very, very, very broad understandings of different health belief systems, we have African belief systems. A wide range of traditional medical systems continue to flourish in Africa. These include a mixture of herbal and physical remedies intertwined with various religious belief systems. Two dimensions are paramount in understanding African health beliefs: spiritual influences and a communal orientation. It is common to attribute illness to the work of ancestors or to supernatural forces. Inadequate respect for ancestors can supposedly lead to illness, while magical influences can both be positive and negative, as well as contemporary and historical in nature. So here again, we have this quote-unquote traditional with the same caveats as applied as before, influencing these beliefs in health and illness. And those, again, are going to include predominantly some combination of spiritual beliefs, so representing kind of the intergenerational connection to the past and the future. So again, your health is bigger than yourself. You are connected to other people that have lived and may not have lived yet, depending on your specific kind of spiritual belief, and also your community. So the cohesiveness of the community kind of impacting your health and also your health-related decision. So your health is not just quote unquote your individual health, but a combination of your community around you and your elders within that community, people who have lived and died, X amount of years ago. So you have a combination ultimately of things beyond your control or things with limited direct control that you can immediately change at the very least. So because of the impact of supernatural forces that can occur like historically or someone living like immediately right now, illness can be attributed to the work of some malign living person. Thus, the role of the spiritual healer is to identify the source of the malign influence. The African culture at large has a communal orientation. Malign influence of certain supernatural forces can be felt not just by an individual, but also by other members of his or her family or community. Intervention may be aimed not only at the individual, but at the family community level. So because there are supernatural elements related to health, you need someone who can work to resolve whatever malign supernatural elements that are negatively affecting you. And consistent with kind of the communal orientation of health traditionally found in African culture, these malign influences often don't just impact you as an individual, but impact like your community, your tribe, your neighborhood, something along those lines. And as such, the medical interventions are kind of best or most successful in general when you are integrating or targeting kind of the community level, bringing because of the interconnection, the broadly speaking, overgeneralized term, collective nature of these groups of people. Working with and through the collective, whether that be elders of the community or whatever the structure of that community is, generally is most beneficial, or I should say, higher rates of effectiveness. Now let's look at some specific studies related to African health beliefs. Findings from a systematic review suggested that despite cultural and linguistic diversity across many regions of Africa, participants reported similar barriers. That is, a fear of procedure and the possibility of negative outcomes, lack of awareness, embarrassment and stigma, lack of spousal support, and other factors such as the cost of accessing the service, travel costs, waiting times, and negative staff attitude. So some barriers to engaging with more kind of formal health institutions, again, include maybe fear of negative outcome, embarrassment and stigma associated with engaging with that system. So maybe that person will feel that their cultural background is under prioritized and not welcome, and thus kind of decreasing a willingness to engage with healthcare institutions because of that stigma. Then you have the lack of spousal support, so kind of maybe those institutions not taking an appropriate collective view to health, thus kind of discouraging willingness to engage with these healthcare systems. And then classic kind of just like the issues of living in poverty. So just accessing the service. The cost of healthcare is kind of a big problem when I was working with people Congolese people in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. A big issue was paying for medical bills, and that contributed to people staying at home and trying to use kind of makeshift procedures because they could not afford to pay for medical services, as well as travel costs. So travel infrastructure is very underdeveloped across Africa, and thus that challenge of getting to medical facilities is obviously going to kind of decrease your willingness and ability and act as a barrier to access appropriate healthcare. Skinner and Claessens in 2016 explored the factors that influence initiation and adherence to tuberculosis treatment in South Africa. What they found is that lower knowledge, stigma around tuberculosis and its connections to HIV were raised as key issues. Structural factors included poverty, lack of access to transportation, the need to continue working, and problems related to the poor functioning of health systems were also raised as major constraints. So kind of concerns about stigma and medical literacy as a couple of primary sources associated with adherence to treatment of tuberculosis in South Africa. As well as what we already talked about before, poverty, lack of access to transportation, also kind of the need to work. So because, one reason of lack of transportation is a barrier is because it just takes so long to get to a medical facility, which means you have less time to work, which is especially problematic when you're dealing with people who live in countries who are disproportionately more likely to live in poverty. You cannot afford to take off excessive time to go travel to seek treatment for, in this case here, tuberculosis, which suggests that you need to resolve, again, going back to, you kind of need to address poverty to increase health outcomes in this population. Herzlich's 1973 work concluded that health was conceived as an attribute of the individual, a state of harmony and balance. Illness was attributed to outside forces in our society or way of life. Lay people also refer to illness in terms of both organic and psychosocial factors. So now we're going to look at how people in Western Europe and the US look and conceive of health. And broadly speaking, people understand health and illness as a combination of organic and psychosocial factors. A study from Blackster in 1990 analyzed and classified definitions of health provided by over 9,000 British adults into the following 9 classifications or themes. 1, health as not ill, that is the absence of physical symptoms. 2, health despite disease. 3, health as a reserve. 4, health as a behavior. 5, health as physical fitness. 6, health as vitality. 7, health as psychosocial well-being. 8, health as social relationships. And 9, health as function. The authors noted that there was considerable agreement in the emphasis of behavioral factors as a cause of illness. The participants commented on they had limited comments and references to structural or environmental factors, especially among those from working class backgrounds. So stopping there, we have this study in 1990 of 9,000 British adults, how they viewed health. And you can see kind of a wide range of support. But as the authors noted, most of the beliefs in health really rooted in kind of that idea of individual behaviors. Now, it's important to note that this study was completed in 1990, almost 30 years ago, which had a specific kind of a historical period, really coming out of almost the end of the Cold War and kind of this those values associated with kind of Western Europe really being internalized during that period, among all kinds of other factors. So this not necessarily may not be, it's actually not going to be as robust as it is as it was in 1990. That is, ideas of health only being individual behavior have shifted even within Western Europe over time. Now, relatedly, though, a study of Canadian baby boomers found the dominant viewpoint was in terms of lifestyle and personal responsibility. Again, very much rooted in kind of those Western beliefs. Now, in general, I should say, generation analysis is kind of hokum, largely nonsense. But what can be beneficial of it is that people do exist within particular historical periods, and those particular historical periods have dominant views. There are sets of resources that are present or not present in other times. Same thing with technology. So in those regards, it can have limited use. But the idea that like Canadian baby boomers are the same as like Ugandan baby boomers and have a meaningful like connection with each other, while in some it's during some periods can be true because they live in the same globe at the same period of time. There's just massive variation. There's generation analysis largely has little predictive power and very little use in general. But baby boomers did develop during a specific historical period, and that historical period really being influenced by that idea that health is really rooted in personal responsibility. The World Health Organization's definition of health, for example, and the biopsychosocial model does not really it exists in the Western Europe, but really does not gain influence until decades after the baby boomers or a couple decades after the baby boomers are born. Complementary and alternative medicine. Alternative healthcare systems tend to be disparaged and marginalized by advocates of biomedicine. Because this is based on positive practitioners of biomedicine believe that the material existence of medical science is independent of any patient's psychological search for meaning, understanding, and control. Alternative perspectives are seen as basically flawed. In spite of this resistance from orthodoxy, alternative professional systems of healthcare continue to exist. So, although the biomedical model is still predominant, but granted, a biopsychosocial model is widely taught across all medical schools in the United States. Still, that kind of cultural legacy still does exist. However, that does not mean that people will follow it. So, despite kind of that cultural background, you see a lot of many people kind of seek out kind of alternative treatments, which can range from just complete bogus / like actively harmful to you to really does nothing to okay, this could be beneficial. And then the question is like, why? Why did they do that? Which is a long conversation of why you seek out alternative medicine, some of which we'll cover momentarily, but it's too long, too in depth to cover in this lecture. In major Western metropolitan centers, there is extensive availability of healthcare systems other than biomedicine. Feedback into Western ways of thinking about health and illness, especially among those who are disenchanted with biomedicine. Increasingly, complementary and alternative medicine, CAM, is gaining popularity and respectability in Western healthcare systems. CAM encompasses all health systems and practices other than those of the established health system of a society. So again, CAM can range from just complete bogus, absolute harmful things to who cares, it's not really hurting you, whatever, it gives you some kind of meaning, whatever, you go with God, to, okay, this is actually some level of positive benefit. But ultimately here, we have people in the West seeking out these CAM alternative treatments, which can be due to multiple reasons. Maybe a general alienation of society, like, oh, society is bad in some ways. Maybe they're out to get you, or it's just like corrupt or just insufficient in some ways. So kind of a questioning kind of the status quo. And ranges and can include some kind of like alienation, some social dislocation. You can Google social dislocation psychology. And this can be rooted in a lot of things, but also, you can think of like belief systems that generally exist. So maybe if you are in believe that health is just the absence of illness, you're like, okay, well, I don't have like cancer, but I feel like shit. Like, what is wrong with me? So this viewpoint of absence of illness as health is just like insufficient. This is not helping me. So therefore, I need to seek alternative. Now, a thing about alternative medicine, as a little side note here, is that you see this especially with kind of like mindfulness, kind of stuff like this, and what you'll see often, especially in the West, is that people will pick like a specific aspect or cultural practice and then try and bring it into their life without realizing that, as kind of discussed, it's not just a specific individual cultural practice, but rather an entire worldview, an entire society built around that healthcare belief system. It's not that you can just take whatever, just broadly speaking, like a Buddhist health belief system and be like, okay, well, that's me now. That's like, by definition, that's not, it's a collective ideology, a collective philosophy that is going to most beneficially manifest itself within a society that structures all their educational belief systems, their social relationships with each other, their political, economic, and social structures based around that health belief system, or the health system is rooted or downstream of those larger structures. So just taking that individual belief system, you're like, okay, well, that's me. Well, it's not really that easy. So what you end up getting is kind of like this blend of like Western, individual, capital, political like views blended in with like this whatever mindfulness Buddhist kind of situation, and which is one reason why some people will kind of realize that on some level, and they're like, you know what, we're gonna like leave society and go join a compound and create our own society, which then hit or miss can end up becoming like a cult at times. All right, so let's talk about some CAMs here. We have herbal medicine. Herbal medicine involves the use of plants and plant extracts to treat illnesses and to promote well-being. Practice has been used for thousands of years, with the first recorded use, according to Brown in 2007, was China in 2800, before the Common Era. Believed that this practice was derived from the Ayurvedic tradition and then later adopted by the Chinese, Greeks, and Romans. Now, granted, when you go into this historical archives of before the Common Era, it's like very difficult to do so because we've lost. I mean, people either didn't write to pass down cultural practices. It was done orally, and then those people die out, or they blend the culture. Civilizations die out, or people choose to build a different civilization. So much of, or arguably most of human history, we don't know. But as a rough marker, we have this 2800 before the Common Era in China, using herbal medicines as a way to promote well-being and treat illnesses. With the growth of pharmaceutical industry, herbal medicine can now be produced and marketed on a massive scale. In the UK, about 1 in 3 adults take herbal medicine, while in the US, it's about 20%. At present, there is limited support for a few specific treatments, but the evidence is inconclusive for many of the most popular herbal medicines. We ultimately need more randomized controlled trials. So we see high rates of use here for herbal medicines in the US and the UK, are big two Anglo countries. And we have evidence that some of them works, but a lot of it is also not pseudoscience related. So kind of trying to differentiate between what is pseudoscience and what is not is going to require kind of more randomized controlled trials in general. And there's probably some kind of like health related benefit to gathering herbs yourself as like a collective for society, being in nature and all this stuff, versus like just buying a pill and popping it. Like there's probably going to be a qualitative difference in the social organization and kind of social bonding that goes into how you gather like herbs and medicines and stuff like that, which will in return kind of impact your health outcomes. So again, kind of trying to take these kind of quote unquote traditional practices in the non Western world and then sort of force feed it into like our kind of mass kind of produced understanding of health. Can be tricky to say the least. Aromatherapy involves the use of essential oils from plant extracts for therapeutic purposes. This practice dates back to ancient Egyptian, Chinese, and Indian traditions. The French chemist and scholar René Maurice Gadesfosse, sorry my French people, I feel like I'm pretty good in accents in general. French, not good. Is considered the father of modern aromatherapy. Discovered the healing properties of lavender when he accidentally burned his hand while working in the laboratory. He continued to experiment on essential oils, including thyme, lemon, and cloves, and used these with First World War I soldiers as antiseptics. Systematic reviews of aromatherapy, however, have produced inconclusive results. So we have a classic scenario in science wherein you're working on something completely different. Something accidentally happens and you discover something. You're like, oh, look at this. So then you have lavender and it's like, oh, this has a healing property, kind of like aloe or something like that. And then you see lavender and like hand soaps and all this kind of stuff. But again, kind of evidence is very, very much inconclusive. You need more randomized controlled studies, but ultimately, like all these kind of little alternative things, the understanding could be of them, the effectiveness of them could be similar to understanding of anything we've talked about in this class, wherein like one specific treatment or lifestyle change is generally insufficient. And especially when it's happening at an individual level. Because as we talked about, health is not just impacted by this one single factor. Like, oh, I have now sniffed lavender today. Now I don't have depression anymore. Now the world I live in is not shitty anymore. And now I don't feel bad about the world. I have purpose in my life. So these things are like massive like psychological constructs and health outcomes that involves many factors. Thus, you're going to see this for most of these CAM situations of either having inconclusive results or kind of like small effect sizes, because there isn't kind of, unfortunately, like one approach to CAM is that people think of it as like this other new unexplored magical solution, as opposed to the older magical solutions that existed, rather than viewing health holistically. It's kind of like a critique of CAM at large, really kind of replicating previous beliefs in health, but just kind of identifying new sources of remedies. The World Health Organization launched a strategy on traditional medicine to support the development of policies and action plans to strengthen the role of CAM, to improve health, well-being, and people-centered healthcare, promote quality and safety of CAM through regulation and better training and skills development of practitioners. Strategy aims to build a knowledge base around CAM, regulate products, therapies, and practitioners, and integrate CAM into the national healthcare system. So basically what the World Health Organization is saying here is that let's study this thing. Let's have systematic, randomly controlled trials, and let's ultimately bring these people into the health-related, to our national healthcare system. Because one big issue, especially in the United States, is that those kind of herbal medicines and stuff are not really regulated in the United States, especially not to the same degree as prescription medication. So sometimes you'll buy like product, like this is a classic example of like melatonin. You'll buy a melatonin product and it just like doesn't have only melatonin in it. It'll have a bunch of other shit in it, or just less melatonin than it reports. It's because ultimately it's just like kind of deregulated. So basically, the World Health Organization is saying, okay, let's develop some policies. Let's regulate. Let's see what the strengths and weaknesses are, and how can we incorporate this into our kind of holistic understanding of health. And one aspect of that, which can be important, is kind of this people-centered understanding of healthcare, because going to a doctor can feel a little bit alienating. You go there, maybe that doctor doesn't have time because they're short-staffed or whatever to really see you, talk to you, discuss something with you, kind of just tell you what they think, and then they kind of move on. So maybe that kind of like depersonalization, it can be a demotivating factor for people to engage in health, empirically verified healthy, beneficial practices. So like one of the big appeals of like CAM practitioners is like a person is working with you one-on-one. They're offering you some kind of like social validation, which can improve like your feelings of empowerment and agency and control. So maybe taking psychosocial elements of CAM and maybe trying to incorporate that into national healthcare systems, or in the case of the United States, whatever you can get, emergency room or something along those lines. Next, Indigenous health. There are almost 400 million Indigenous people from thousands of different cultures in all continents of the planet. Generally, Indigenous people experience poorer health outcomes than their non-Indigenous counterparts. For example, Indigenous populations are 6 times more likely to die from injuries. They are disproportionately affected by forced displacement caused by natural disaster, armed conflict, loss of their ancestral domains, and have worse access to health services and education. And some studies have found that American Indians are less likely to use alcohol than non-American Indians in the U.S., but when they do consume alcohol, they consume higher rates of alcohol, which is just maybe a greater likelihood of or greater risk of addiction. So we see Indigenous people, for self-obvious reasons, in the U.S., for example, history of colonialism, of forced displacement, a massacre, and all these things have left Indigenous people in a kind of state of health-related precarity. And like many of the other cultures we've talked about, health is viewed, and Indigenous people in general kind of view themselves through a collective lens. Thus, when designing interventions, it is essential to actively involve community members in action plans to address issues. Participatory action research can be used to facilitate the process of surfacing knowledge that is relevant, respectful, and useful. The process involving Indigenous participants helps to establish rapport and trust, as well as facilitate equal power sharing between members or researchers and community members. Genuine participation helps develop personal and community skills that can strengthen community capacity. So, as historically well documented, there was a systematic approach to disempower Indigenous people, which is obviously, besides death, is going to negatively impact their health outcomes. Because it's directly basically disenfranchising them from the kind of larger U.S. society and kind of stripped them of their healthcare related systems and kind of due to a combination of loss of resources, land, and language, and through kind of a formal colonialization process. As such, kind of the argument is approaches to Indigenous health must be rooted in kind of building empowerment within these people. So this is going to involve trust and reciprocity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, in active participation and voice of Indigenous people, which in return can strengthen their personal and community resources and skills, and in general build community capacity, which will allow them as a group to advocate for themselves and kind of rebuild and build on their customs, which and practices which were targeted across centuries. So a classic example of kind of the impact of your psychosocial conditions, your history on your health. There's actually very good research that looked into cocaine addiction in, I believe, Vancouver, and the disproportionate rates of addiction of Indigenous people who were just, historically have been displaced. And kind of the idea being that that kind of loss of culture, loss of meaning, connection, contributing to decrease of purpose, and in return, relying on kind of drugs to resolve that pain, maybe find like physical and like emotional warmth, and just cope in some ways with that, just broadly speaking, intergenerational kind of collective pain. There's a lot of good research out of North Dakota University, actually. I almost went there for grad school because of that program. But if you're interested in that, check them out. Now, reviewing some Indigenous studies, Butler and his friends, that's how I like to refer to et al. In 2019, sought to identify the domains of well-being that are congruent with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' health. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are the Indigenous people of Australia, or some of them, I should say, one group of them. What the research found that 9 dimensions were related to the well-being of this group. They include autonomy, empowerment, and recognition, family and community, culture, spirituality and identity, country, basic needs being met, works, roles and responsibilities, education, physical health, and mental health. Culture, spirituality, and identity are separate yet interrelated domains that have a multi-directional relationship. Each domain can influence and strengthen the other, with all 3 factors found to impact well-being and happiness positively. Country, while a separate domain, was also interconnected with culture, spirituality, and identity. So stopping there, you can see here, we have this basically a systematic review of predictors of health within this Australian Aboriginal sample. And you can see what I talked about before, this idea of empowerment, the idea of community, their culture, their spirituality, their basic needs being met, having roles in workers or work and responsibility. So kind of like that, again, kind of reciprocity, that connection to each other that gives you purpose and meaning in life. Education, so the ability to transmit your cultural values, your language, which allows you to communicate values that have been passed down to your generation, because language is not just as anyone who speaks to multiple languages knows, that within language, there are some things that don't directly translate. And those kind of messages, those cultural values embedded within language is important to building up Indigenous people's identity, cultural spirituality, etc. So as such, a classic example of just not reducing health to your individual behaviors that would be literally just rejected by these people as just nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. Also, another study here found that being on the quote-unquote country was identified as restorative to one's well-being and builds resilience, while cultural practices, as identified by one paper, was a way to increase resilience in the face of racism and trauma. So in this case here, being on quote unquote the country, so broadly speaking, slang here, Indian country. So being among your people, and thus kind of able to establish like a community and rebuild again this your family, your community, meet your basic needs as a kind of a collective, and interestingly build resilience. In the West, we often view resilience as like this individual attribute that you have or you don't have, or something you have to just grind for or something. Here, not seen that way. This is a collective understanding of resilience or protective factors through cultural practices that decrease the impact of stressors on your life, and also decrease probably the likelihood of experiencing stressors, because you now have that kind of empowerment that can reduce the likelihood that your language and way of life is stripped away from you. Racism and health. Racism contributes to poor mental and physical health among migrants, ethnic minority groups, and indigenous people. A chronic accumulation of discrimination is related to stress that can potentially increase risk of chronic illnesses. Systematic reviews examining the impact of racial discrimination on health have shown how perceived discrimination is linked with physical ill health. Let's discuss some specific findings to demonstrate this. DeLilly and Flaskerud, if you're listening, in 2012 suggested that the poor health outcomes related to perceived racial discrimination are associated with negative feelings of low self-worth and subordination. Even after controlling for factors such as perceived neighborhood safety, food insecurity, and financial stress, these associations were still significant. Sometimes this can be manifested as depression, or can be expressed through anger, hostility, or aggression. So here we found in the DeLilly study, DeLilly, I was not an author, the royal we, as the English would say, found that racial discrimination, even after controlling for things such as food insecurity and class, roughly defined as financial stress, it was found that perceived racial discrimination was associated with rates of higher rates of low self-worth and subordination. So you're kind of devaluating yourself, and kind of increasing a sense of inferiority, which in return is obviously going to be depression. But at the same time, sometimes you don't. It can manifest itself internally, like an internalizing system such as depression, or externally through aggression, anger, and hostility, because it doesn't feel great to be subordinated against, made to be felt inferior. Bermudez Milan and his friends or her friends, don't know, in 2016 found that while lower income predicted lower physical activity as well as poor sleep quality and medical adherence, racial discrimination was associated with increases in food intake and alcohol consumption. So here we have impacts of class and race, both impacting kind of different results or different negative health-related behaviors. So in one case, lower sleep quality related to kind of a lower income / class, while racial discrimination associated with an increase in alcohol consumption. So kind of maybe possibly using that alcohol to kind of cope with a society that's treating you poorly, and maybe your belief that like, oh, well, I can't really directly change this society, so what can I do? I'm going to self-medicate, decrease the stress through drugs, which is pretty consistent across kind of the history of alcohol abuse. Cheng in 2013 conducted a set of in-depth interviews with 18 participants from northern England. Findings suggested that participants felt that messages around healthy lifestyle practices were not applicable to their everyday lives. They often ignored issues related to their experiences of social exclusion, racism, and ethnic identity. The authors concluded, based on these results, that health promotion programs that use exclusively individualistic approaches are inappropriate for and isolate those from ethnic minority communities who practice more collectivist traditions to express their beliefs, values, and identities. Campaigns that try to promote healthy lifestyles need to consider the socioeconomic and cultural context, including issues related with disadvantage, racism, and marginalization, to enable minority ethnic groups to incorporate their messages and practices into their everyday lives. So basically the argument here is that that often there is low ecological validity with healthcare recommendations. So it's like, you're telling me to engage in a behavior that's literally not realistic. I cannot do this, and you're overlooking why I can't do this, and why. And the fact that you're overlooking this is kind of rooted in kind of like historical racism and social exclusion, or xenophobia against my ethnic identity, or cultural background, something along those lines. So, kind of the idea here is that again, there needs to be when trying to help people improve their health outcomes, you have to consider the social conditions that they live in, or otherwise you can actually increase alienation and kind of decrease trust in these kind of health systems, because it's like, you're not listening to me, you don't understand what I'm going to. This actually, the way that you're approaching health and telling me what to do actually supports and increases my alienation. It confirms it, because once again, it's not connected to my hashtag lived experiences. Now, there is a good research about the accumulation of racial-related stress on health outcomes. It's very similar to allostatic load. It's called the weathering effect. This is from Arlene. I don't know how to pronounce her name because I've never heard her speak. It's either Geronimus or Geronimus. It's Geronimus out of the University of Michigan. Does great research and kind of looking at the accumulation of social exclusion, racism on a vast number of health-related outcomes, if you are interested in that. Refugees and asylum seekers. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency report, over 65 million people have been forcibly displaced worldwide in 2015. I should note that number has increased since then. A study of 150,000 Assyrian refugees living outside of camps in Jordan in 2014, nearly 2/3 were living below the national poverty line. Communicable diseases are major causes of morbidity among refugees. Children under the age of 5 are most vulnerable, with cases of measles, respiratory tract infections, diarrhea, and severe acute malnutrition soaring at high levels. So refugees bring with them a traumatic past. Obviously, they're refugees for a reason. So they're bringing with them kind of a accumulated amount of significant stress often. They are at the same time losing protective factors because they've lost their home. They're being uprooted from their cultures. They're now living in maybe refugee camps, and which are historically are always way underfunded. So depending on the severity of the underfunding and kind of the formal nature of the refugee camps, you see widespread spreading of diseases, typically associated with kind of dirty drinking water. So people have to rely on dirty drinking water, which is going to spread maybe a cholera or diarrhea, which is a massive risk factor for young children. While at the same time, children kind of losing out because they don't have educational access, and are often being not just kind of taking on additional stressors by living in the camp, but also if their home country is still being subject to whatever, some kind of war or something, or maybe a natural disaster, they are obviously going to be following that and kind of increasing stress. So that kind of the accumulation of stressors, maybe a feeling of hopelessness, depending on how long the conflict or natural disaster is lasted, is big risk factors for chronic health, or the development of chronic health conditions. So it's just a couple recommendations for culturally competent healthcare systems. Culturally competent healthcare involves developing culturally sensitive staff who are able to reflect about their own beliefs and practices and acknowledge diversity in the community, and culturally appropriate materials, activities, and systems that address linguistic, cultural, and social barriers. Training healthcare professionals to develop skills that enable them to deal with communication issues associated with cultural, language, health literacy differences may be a good way to reduce some inequalities in health. So kind of increasing maybe sensitivity, education, developing materials appropriate for those differences in your clients, Indigenous, ethnic minorities, lower class, whatever. But kind of like everything in this class, asking doctors to do all that themselves is quite difficult. You cannot be an expert on every culture. You cannot design programs that help to improve physical and psychological outcomes by yourself. These are going to require, whatever, depending on the country, your state, the federal government, some kind of, NGO or something like that, or the international resources, because just like health is impacted by multiple factors beyond the individual. Treatment, care, health promotion cannot only be limited to one individual healthcare professional. Now, research has found that training healthcare professionals to develop skills that enable them to deal with communication issues are associated with cultural, linguistic, and health literacy differences, which may be a good way to reduce inequities in health. So improving communication skills and training, there is some evidence that it can decrease health inequalities. But again, that is like most individual or one little solution is going to be insufficient according to health onion model and stuff like that. But it's still kind of worth the effort to at least kind of engaging with what are your cultural belief systems, which allows you to, further ask why and what you can do to kind of improve health outcomes for those population who historically have been most disenfranchised by societies. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great week. Bye.